Is leasing an apartment in Colombia really that important, or are there some better alternatives? Hi all, I'm Ezrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So I've noticed that there's a bunch of videos on YouTube where people are interviewing Colombian real estate agents and discussing how to get a lease, what some of the red flags you should look out for are, and just generally how to go about finding these listings. And whilst I think this is useful advice for people who are seriously considering settling down in Colombia long term, I do find it interesting, to put it nicely, that a lot of these videos seem to be pitched towards people who are considering coming to Colombia for their first time and likely haven't even stayed in a hotel for a single night there yet. Now, I get that it's nice to have some cursory knowledge of how the lease system over there works if you're new to the country, but I think an important disclaimer needs to be made, and that is that if it's your first time in Colombia and you're not staying in a single city or town there for more than a year, you probably shouldn't lease a place. Now, I know it sounds quite authoritative to make a statement like this, and ultimately I'm not going to tell you what you need to do, but if you want my advice at least, I would highly advise against leasing a place if you're new to the country. But before I tell you why that's the case, let me just go over the main reasons people might lease to begin with. So the first one is price. Leasing a place is generally considerably cheaper than Airbnb or hotels, sometimes even half the cost for the same quality of accommodation. The reason for that, I'd say, is that Airbnbs and hotels are often targeted towards tourists who are ready to pay more for a short-term stay, whereas leases are usually more aimed at Colombians looking for somewhere to live more permanently and is therefore more in line with Colombian wages. And then the other reason you might want to lease is if you happen to want to furnish the place yourself, as most of the time when you lease a place, it's going to be unfurnished. This, of course, could be a downside for you though if you don't want to outlay a bunch of money on furniture, which I'll get to later on. Okay, so why don't I recommend leasing for newcomers? Well, the thing with leasing in Colombia is that most of the time there is a minimum lease period of either 6 months or a year, depending on the place, and in some very rare cases 3 months, but that's really not common. So if you're coming to Colombia under a tourist permit, you're only going to be able to be there for the legal maximum of 6 months within a calendar year. So going to the hassle of leasing a place that probably has a 6-month minimum lease period, or in many cases a 1-year minimum, it's a bit of a hassle to go through, as you're probably only going to be able to be in the country for a single term of that lease or less. Now, if you come to Colombia in, say, June and then leave in December, you could technically come back for another 6 months the following calendar year, which would allow you to get a bit more time out of your lease. But even still, you've got to consider that it might take you a bit of time to find a good agent and a good place that has everything you need, so it's not likely something you'll have from day one. So you might say, okay, but does it really matter if I only get 1 or 2 maximum terms out of the lease before I end the contract? Like, why is having a short-term lease an issue to begin with? And although at face value I understand this argument, there are a couple of things you should consider. Firstly, when it comes to leasing in Colombia, one thing you'll need in most cases is a co-signer for the contract. This is essentially someone who is a Colombian citizen and agrees to be collateral. So if you fail to pay rent, they can be relied on as a backup person. So now this already brings in the matter of having to find someone who would be willing to do that for you, but to make things trickier, the co-signer also has to be someone who owns property or earns a relatively high income. If you don't happen to know any Colombians who fit this category, there is another option where you can, in advance, put a bunch of money down into an account known as a CDT, and this is an account that can't be touched but is there to contain backup money, so if you fail to pay rent for a month, they can just take money out of that account instead of from another person. The downside to that though is that you'll generally have to put in anywhere from 5 to 15 times the amount of your monthly rent into this account in advance before you even start paying your rent each month. One thing I also just wanted to point out is that there are actually some real estate agents that are a little bit more lenient with the conditions and will allow you to bypass a CDT or a co-signer if you pay for a bunch of rent in advance. So like, for instance, 3 or 6 months rent in advance. And then the other thing I'd say is that sometimes you can get in touch directly with the owner instead of a real estate agent. And when you do that, they can be a little bit more lenient with the conditions. So, you know, they might ask for, again, just rent in advance instead of going through the whole CDT or cosigner system. But yeah, both of these things are the exception rather than the norm. The other thing worth pointing out too is that deposits in Colombia, like security deposits, are technically illegal. So if anyone does ask you for a deposit instead of a CDT or cosigner, I personally wouldn't go with that unless you're going through like an insurance agency as an intermediary. But otherwise, yeah, deposits are technically illegal and you probably shouldn't take up anyone on that deal. But anyway, just a couple of things I wanted to point out. Back to the video. I will add a disclaimer that there are instances where you can get an apartment without a cosigner or CDT, but from my experience, I noticed this tended to be for very cheap apartments, oftentimes, but not necessarily in poorer or unsafe neighborhoods. So if you want something of a great standard in a nice area, you'll probably need a form of collateral. Now, if I haven't scared newcomers off from leasing yet, there is one more reason I'll give for reconsidering this, and that is, as I alluded to earlier, the fact that you'll probably have to furnish the place yourself. As I said before, most places up for lease come unfurnished, so you're gonna have to outlay a bunch of money buying your own furniture, getting it sent to your apartment, setting it up, and if you're only there for like 6 or 12 months, this, at least to me, feels like way more hassle than it's worth, especially when you consider that you're then gonna have to rent out a large storage unit to store your furniture if you cancel your contract after the minimum lease period. So with all of this in mind, I really don't think leasing is worth it if you're not 100% certain that you wanna live in Colombia for at least several years, and this is a tricky thing to be certain about unless you've already visited for at least several months to get an idea of what the country's like. So if you are a newcomer, what would my suggestion be for you? Well, there are a couple of things you could do. My recommendation would actually be to book a place on Airbnb. Yes, it's more expensive than leasing, but there's usually no minimum rental period. I mean, maybe like a week minimum, but nothing like 6 months in the contract you have on leases. And more importantly, you don't need a cosigner, a CDT, or collateral of any kind. It's just pay for it up front and you're good to go. Of course, it goes without saying that Airbnbs are virtually always furnished as well and have all bills like electricity paid for or included in the listing price. Perhaps my favorite thing about Airbnbs though is just how easy they are to find compared to any other form of accommodation in Colombia. To put it briefly, Colombia doesn't really have the level of internet presence for real estate that you may have in your home country, and the local real estate websites that do exist often leave a lot to be desired, making searching for a place to lease online a bit of a chore. Airbnb, on the other hand, is a multinational company with a robust search engine with every search filter you'll probably ever want. I know this really sounds like an ad, but I promise they are not a sponsor. I just wanted to stress how much easier it is than searching elsewhere online in Colombia for accommodation. In terms of downsides of Airbnb though, the main thing would be that, as I said, they are generally more expensive than leasing a place, but trust me when I say they are still extremely cheap compared to Airbnbs in the first world country you might be coming from, like the US, England, Australia, etc. Of course, with Airbnb, you also need to pay the full term of the stay upfront, which could be an advantage or disadvantage depending on how you like to pay. So yeah, Airbnbs would be the first option for newcomers and short-term expats. The other option is something that's a little trickier to find, but might suit you better depending on what you're looking for, and that is subleasing. So this is essentially where there's someone else who's already leased a place themselves, and now they're advertising it for anyone who wants to stay there for a monthly fee. Sometimes you might be sharing the place with this person, and sometimes they're nowhere to be seen, but have already found some subleases and put them in charge of advertising the place for more subleases, meaning you could be sharing the place with multiple people. Now, I guess Airbnb can also be hosted by people on a lease too, which would technically make it subleasing, but I'm still gonna put this in a separate category just because of the difference in the means of how you go about finding this accommodation. So subleasing is actually something I did in Sydney, as sharing an apartment with multiple people brought the price down considerably, as it would in Colombia as well. As I said before, Colombia is sorely lacking in robust, helpful real estate websites. Instead, the most popular way to sublease in Colombia seems to be through Facebook Marketplace. So you have people listing their places here and you can just message them if you're interested. So with all of that being said, if you want to try your hand in the wild west of Facebook Marketplace, you might find something, but if you're very picky about the exact location and a bunch of other factors, just know that Airbnb has by far the most robust search tool for accommodation in Colombia. One more thing I'll quickly mention is that if you're looking for somewhere to stay for the first week or so of your trip to Colombia, and you don't want the hassle of having to be in contact with the Airbnb host before checking in, but would rather just get somewhere so you can sleep off the jet lag ASAP, I would recommend the hotel chain Allenda. They're probably one of the most widespread hotel chains across Colombia and have a lot of options for different budgets, all whilst retaining a good standard across the board. I can personally vouch for the one in El Campín in Bogota, which was reasonably modern and had a nice big bed and bathroom, along with friendly and helpful staff in the reception area. Plus, it's in a fairly safe location, just as most of the Allenda hotels are, to be honest. So yeah, if you're looking for somewhere to crash at the beginning of your trip that's easy to check into, that's my recommendation. Long term though, you'll probably find Airbnbs to be cheaper than hotels of the same standard, so this is really just something I'd recommend for the short term. Alright, so I think I've rambled enough for this one. I hope I've answered any questions you might have, but if you want to know more about Colombia, feel free to subscribe and bell for more videos, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao!